All right, just let me know when you'd like me to move through the slides.
Okay.
Okay, so I told everybody that, you know, we did a session at USCA, USCA, I don't know why I always do that. And Danielle really got it together, got the presenters, you know, worked up the slides and all that good stuff. So I'm just going to let her go for it today. I did a thing on you know, cure research generally, but I don't really think we need to do that today. So I'm going to leave it to Danielle and Eileen, and ladies, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Lynda. So I'm Danielle Campbell. They're cast members and coaching. Introduce yourself. Eileen, did we lose you? You muted.
Daniel, I can't hear you.
Hey, you sound like you're underwater.
Me?
You sound like you're really far away.
Can you guys hear me now?
Much better.
That's much better.
I'm Danielle Campbell, a CAB member with DARE, and I'm also the co-chair alongside Lynda D. As a brief introduction, Eileen, did you want to take a moment and introduce yourself as well?
Sure, thank you. Sorry, I'm new to Zoom. Couldn't figure out how to unmute myself. I'm Eileen. I'm a biomedical researcher, and I do work specifically around sex differences in cure and have had the chance to really benefit from DARE in the past. So happy to be here today.
Happy to have you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Okay, ladies, go for it.
Alrighty, so wanted to take time again to thank NMAC, DARE, Eileen, all the other co-presenters, Lynda D, Liz Barr, Karine Dubé, and Dr. Kimberly Parker for taking time to help develop our session outline, content, and slides. And I wanted to send a special thanks to the folks at NMAC, Moises Augusto, fellow CAB member, who provided us the platform at USCA to discuss such a critical issue. We were only one of 2 HIV cure focused presentations, the other of which focused on community involvement around HIV cure advocacy. So we were delighted to be able to deliver the only women-centered HIV cure session at USCA. Can you all hear me well?
Yeah, and Steve, thank you
Yes.
for letting us use DARE funds to get there.
Absolutely.
It was a good investment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Next slide, L9. So on today's call, we're really just going to hit the high points of some of the content that was discussed at the USCA session. Here's a brief outline of what we covered. Of course, we overviewed HIV cure research, current strategies being explored that have led to a developed cure. And we also discussed, Lynda gave us a brief overview of some of the HIV cure science coming down the pipeline. Eileen did a Women in HIV Epi presentation to ground the need for inclusion of women in cure trials. So Liz Barr discussed and overviewed women's participation in clinical and cure trials, and we sought to include content on both, given the large numbers of disparities in enrollment of women in both cure trials specifically, but in overall the clinical research framework. So Liz also discussed some of the facilitators and barriers of women's participation in HIV cure trials specifically, but we won't have her slides to share today. We didn't get her permission in time to deliver this webinar. So hopefully in the future, she'll give us permission to use her slides. So Eileen Scully discussed some of the sex differences in HIV cure and what those implications are in the development of cure strategies moving forward. Kim Parker hit us with some high points around some of the policy implications of the lack of inclusion of women in trials. And then we rounded out the discussion discussing some of the future research directions that involved and are centered around the inclusion of women. Next slide. So we incorporated a really awesome audience engagement component to our session. So we had a couple technical kinks, but at the end of the day, the audience engagement portion was to have high involvement of participants, and it was an SMS text function through an online poll site. So we polled the audience with questions, and then they got to text in what some of their responses were. And so we had in real time what some of the live responses were in percentage rates. And it really helped facilitate a robust discussion between us and the attendees. So some of the objectives of Lynda's scientific overview, really we wanted to have a discussion about what an HIV cure would look like, overview some of the basic scientific principles associated with an HIV cure, because we had a wide range of participants. So we had some frontline folks, some folks who were associated with HIV cure, some of the research being conducted within DARE. So we talked about why is it difficult to cure HIV? Why should we aim for a cure for HIV? Some of the current cure strategies. Next slide. So just to dive in a little bit more about why it's important to have a cure, we wanted to, specifically for women, just given some of the disparities that we see amongst Black women and other women of color, and then when you overlay the lack of participation in clinical research trials, it really speaks to some of the disparities that we see when we talk about the generalizability of some of the science coming out of the MDC network. And then we talked about some of the disparities of global access to ARVs, the medication burden, some of the medication side effects, and generally the overall expense with treatment, and how developing a cure can offset some of those social ills that we see. Next slide. And then next slide. So one of the predominating conversations that we had were what were some of the social and ethical challenges of cure. Really just balancing resources when you talk about in the realm of prevention, trials in healthy participants, and what really that means as a standard measure. Some of the risk versus benefit and safety issues associated with participation in some cure trials, given that there really isn't an upfront outlay benefit to the participant, but really to the contribution to the overall science. So we talked about trial design, specifically ATIs and what it means to in the realm of secondary transmission, and how the provision of PrEP and clinical trials may be useful here. We talked about some of the costs associated with cure trials and the scalability, and how critical that will be to generalizing what a cure will look like for folks who are most impacted. Next slide. So again, just an overview of what I just discussed. ATIs we talked about, participants being required to stop ARVs in a world where U equals U is the prevailing public health message of the day. Treatment as prevention, these are things, when you talk about ATIs and the prevention of secondary transmission, these are concepts that come front and center. It's like a reprogramming of folks when you talk about participation in cure trials, really changing the paradigm of taking your meds once a day as prescribed to, okay, we want you to stop your meds, you know, as a condition of your participation on this clinical research trial. And then we want to really see how your virus rebounds. So that's something that we wanted to discuss as part of the framework of HIV cure trials, and get some of the participant feedbacks around that. Next slide. And so Eileen can give us an overview of the women in HIV epi that was discussed.
Hi, thanks, Danielle. So we can just move forward. I think the main message behind this, again, to the sort of mixed group in the room, is just that, you know, despite the fact that in the US, the representation of women with HIV is largely geographically localized to the US Southeast, that there are, you know, half the people living with HIV in the world are women. And I think sort of to make this broader argument that as we do this really critical biomedical research to develop a cure, we actually probably need to be quite honest that we want to over-enroll women in resource-rich settings in order to ensure that if there are relevant sex differences, that these cures will be applicable to the women living in resource limited settings. And I think that's like always something to consider in terms of whether it's better to move cure trials to where the people are, or to find the people for where the cure trials are being conducted. And I guess I would say I've sort of been favoring the latter more recently, just for the safety and other issues around the kinds of trials that we're doing. So these few slides, and we can move forward to the next one. We're just sort of putting in context the presence of women. Again, this is that data that I was just referencing, the overall prevalence of HIV, and then the prevalence of HIV among women in the United States. These are from AIDSview, which like clearly shows that women are not everywhere in the United States in high numbers, although they are concentrated in certain areas of the US, and they certainly are some women everywhere. We can move forward to the next slide. Yeah, and then this is the labels are swapped here on the bottom, but the racial breakdown of HIV infection in the United States, the age distribution, and the transmission category. And the next slide. But this is also that in general, you know, among women and men who are living with HIV, the receipt of care, retained in care, and viral suppression rates are pretty comparable. So there are women who are likely achieving our entry criteria, even when those entry criteria require long periods of viral suppression. You can go to the next slide. And then these are just some points for discussion that, you know, women living with HIV in the United States in general do have a higher rate of intimate partner violence, sexual abuse, and post-traumatic stress disorder than other women in the United States. I think the next slide. Yeah, so 2 times or 5 times the rate of women in the United States living without HIV. And this is something to be considered as we discuss engaging women in research and the intersections between research questions and sex differences, and how best to reach these populations when we're really seeking to overrepresent women in resource-rich settings. You can move forward. And then if anyone has any questions about those slides, happy to take them.
One question about the PTSD. Is that thought to be or known to be a result of the previous 2 items on that slide?
So
there
is obviously those are both sources of trauma, and so certainly that is related to it. But there is, you know, in general, if you look to where women living with HIV are living in the United States, a lot of them are in centers of poverty. So there's other sources of trauma that are not necessarily related to intimate partner violence. So yes and no.
Thank you. Right.
And then Danielle, I think this next slides are from Liz and Kim. I don't know if you want me to keep moving through those. I'm happy to do that.
And if you'd like.
Sure. I'm pretty sure this is Liz Barr's work. So she has looked across a lot of different trials at the type of trials in which women were participating, and then also looking at in different disciplines like cardiovascular clinical trials. And in general, this has always been true that women are relatively underrepresented. This is partially due to disease burden and things like cardiovascular trials, but it's also partially due to enrollment restrictions and the fact that women are messy and get pregnant, which limits their enrollment in some interventional trials. We can go to the next slide. And then this is, you know, the guidance about inclusion of women, which, you know, is very broad and also, you know, speaks to the idea that we're supposed to not only conduct our studies in ways that are applicable to women, but we're also supposed to be very transparent about it. I will note that these are applicable to phase 3, pivotal phase 2, and phase 4 studies, so not to a lot of the cure research that we're doing, which is often phase 1 or exploratory studies, but still should be considered. And then I think I probably could mention this later, but there was an RFA issued on September 27th that's trans NIH, but includes NIAID, and specifically mentions HIV in the RFP that is looking for R01 applications on sex and gender differences relevant to HIV, to pathogenesis of human disease. So certainly of interest for work in the HIV field, and also specifically speaking to NIH investment in this question.
Are you putting something together for that, Eileen?
I am trying to. It's due November 25th. So not a long turnaround time, but definitely what I was already planning to do it's an R01 specific RFP, but I'm happy to send it. I can send it to you so you can distribute it to anybody else in DARE who's interested.
So Eileen, let me ask you, within, I haven't really worked very closely with the ACTG in many years, but I mean, it's my impression that they do their best to enroll women and people of color, and that their stats in their trials are pretty good in that regard. Am I correct in that assumption?
So I think that, we do well, but I think the thing that I've been, in general, many people do, and to be perfectly honest, if you're doing a very small scientific study, I personally think it's better if you exclude women than enroll only one or two, because that can lead to the false conclusion that there is no sex difference when you've really just not been powered to observe something. I do think that, like, in thinking about cure and really wanting it to be something that actually is being developed for all of the people living with HIV, we have to take on this higher burden of over-enrolling women in order to ensure that what the things that we develop, in particular host-directed therapeutics, are going to be equally efficacious in men and women. So that's a long answer to say we do well, but I think we need to do better, and specifically in cure.
Always better. But as far as, I wasn't really talking about cure trials per se, but in the other trials, I mean, we beat them up for years about doing it. That they were actually doing a good job with the pivotal stuff at this point in phase 3 and the phase 3. But now, what would you suggest for us in cure trials if we can only get a few women and that's going to be worse than none at all? Then what do you think we should do? Do you think it's just a matter of enrollment, trying to get enrollment up?
Well, I think it's like a lot of the things that sort of came up in this discussion that we had at the conference was just like how to engage, and just for people who weren't there, some of the topics that were brought up by the audience were the difficulty for study coordinators in doing additional education because of the time constraints for enrolling participants, and how that can be challenging if you're trying to enroll someone who's never heard of cure. And so doing sort of the outreach and the education and the interest building among women living with HIV, and using the methods that are best targeted for that, which is probably not going to be necessarily clinic-based or support group-based, but rather internet-based or other options where women who tend to be less community-connected in their HIV diagnosis can access information and make decisions about enrolling in trials. That's hard because people don't get budgets for that. So I think, you have to have a willing partner, like how Steve and Becky did, and Monica Gandhi did all of that amazing recruitment to find the women that we did in our original AMFAR study. And in our most recent ACTG study where we enrolled only women, I think honestly, that enrolled super quickly because we were the only new study that was open. So I think it is possible, but it is not as easy as enrolling men.
So can you talk about some of the
studies? Do you think that's the answer?
Sorry, I missed it, Lynda. Bigger studies? Not necessarily, but I think that especially if it's a small study, you can find, if you're doing we found 33 women to participate in a cure trial in 3 months. So, granted that was at 15 sites in the ACTG, but we had pretty strict inclusion criteria, and that was a really fast enrollment. So if you're doing a study of 20 people, you can probably find 10 or at least 8.
Well, I wish we're gonna have to put that on a flag somewhere.
right.
I don't know, Steve, do you think I'm talking crazy talk?
Steve?
No, what you're saying is what I said at the recent collaboratory meeting, but Lynda got up and yelled at me, as I recall. But coming from you, it sounds just much more profound and serious and academic.
I would say profound and serious. I think that part of the challenge as community folks is when the message becomes consistent that women are difficult, women are messy, women require additional resources, it doesn't poise women to want to enroll in clinical trials, right? Part of the biggest community pushback that I get when we have these conversations with women living with other women living with HIV is that what's so difficult about enrolling us into a clinical trial? Is it that trial networks have continued the same recruitment formula, or are they really at a point where they want to address the differences that will be required to meaningfully recruit and include women in clinical trials, especially when you talk about cure trials when, as Eileen said, the enrollment criteria are much more strict, and there is almost certainly a projection of that study will enroll fewer women. So I think part of the message moving forward is around language, right? We want to challenge funders and we want to challenge the powers that be to not necessarily deem women difficult to recruit, but that women require a bit of innovation different than what's been tried and true in other populations, especially when you talk about women of color.
So, but why? So in the cancer arena, it appears that only a third of people who enroll in those studies are women. And cancer, I'm pretty sure half of people with cancer are women, probably a little bit more. And there was a lot of resources that were poured into trying to engage women in these studies, but it never worked. So why is it a problem in cancer?
I think what the deal is, Steve, it's very much like gay men. They're hooked up, they're engaged, they know what's going on much more, and they just get there first oftentimes. I mean, I think with women, just like you all did in that AMPAR study, you're going to have to do a little bit of extra work in the beginning and learn how to do it and learn where to find women, just like you have to find other people.
Absolutely.
And it can be, it can be more complicated, and women have more issues, but it's not impossible. I always tell this story. Back in the day, now the ACTG is on 5,500. That's the numbers they're on. On 175 and 155, back in the day, when not that many women were even being, tested, we made them stop. It was Mark, myself, and Connie Wolfsey, of all people. That's how long ago it was. And we got the ACTG to agree to make them stop enrolling anybody else before they got more women in. And it took no time for them to find them. It's just a matter of, okay, let's stop here, let's change gears and do something different. I mean, just like your cohort comes and they're there and they show up, why do anything different when you've got, what you're doing essentially enrolls your trial? It just means that you have to do things differently to find these women and to keep them.
Agreed. But I think comparing cancer to HIV may be apples to oranges, given the entry point of women into the healthcare system when you talk about diagnosis for cancer. But I do see your point.
I was a cancer survivor, and I used to work with the ECOGs, and they could enroll 2,000 women in no time. Of course, that's one of the big four cancers, the breast cancer. But they didn't have any trouble, So it's just a different talent that you're going to have to learn and perfect. And let me just say, I'm talking too much. I said I would let the ladies take this, but I mean, the reason that I was so angry, I think, is that, you are one of the most prominent researchers in cure research. And all you ever say is, oh, this is so hard. This is so hard. And, if you can't do it, nobody will be able to do it. So it's just a matter, of semantics, of like saying it differently. I mean, I think I know your heart's in it. You actually did do it. You did try. But if you can't just keep saying to people, oh my God, the rest of my hair fell out when I tried to do this. You just have to say, look, we were able to do this, and this is what we did. It was difficult. We had to do things differently. But
Yeah. But Lynda, my point has always been that, and is that it can be done, but it requires resources.
Right.
Yeah.
Which AMPAR provided with us.
Yeah.
A fair amount of resources. And maybe, so I think you said something interesting. It isn't that women are challenging to enroll. It's just altruistic gay white men who survived the Holocaust of the 1980s and 90s, who are now semi-retired, have lots of time, and perhaps a little bit of survivor guilt, and highly engaged as a group. They're easy to enroll. So maybe that's it. It's not that women are hard, but that in HIV we become very used to this very unique population of people who are very intelligent, highly invested, and highly experienced with the concept of clinical research going back to 1988 when the first ACT study started.
And Steve, I totally agree. And I also think that there's this thing, which is that the NIH doesn't want to hear that it costs more. And exactly to Danielle's point of like, you know, calling women messy or all the rest of it, like we don't want to make it sound like they're this difficult thing. But if you know, the costs, I know that, you know, options and scope are always operating on a deficit. So you add to that additional cost needed to bring in people to meet a different set of criteria, like the costs actually have to increase. And there has to be like the NIH sort of support. They're going to fund the additional work required to get different types of people, because as these warriors have moved the field forward, they can't move it forward for the women. They're just not women. So they can't do that.
Absolutely. And it creates this dual accountability, not only to the funders, but the scientists who submit R01s for those funds. So Eileen, you know, I'd be happy to help, you know, help review your proposal or support in any way I can as you start your plans to recruit and enroll women.
Thank you.
The GRACE trial was really very telling. You know, at first they got a lot of women in and they couldn't retain them. And then they learned how to do things to keep women as engaged as gay men are. You know, it's just we have to just think differently, outside the box, get different people to help us, to tell us what to do and how to do this better. And, you know, and just present it like, oh my God, not like, oh my God, we're never going to do this without $1 million. Not that we don't need more money.
And the other thing is that in looking at that map, you know, I mean, Steve, if you look at the map of prevalence of HIV among women, like the area for UCSF is not intense, right? So it is actually really hard for you, but there are centers in the United States where it's not as hard, in the US Southeast. And there are really, you know, that argues for network level work to try and bring together people who are seeing different types of patients.
We also have a pool of women in Southern California. Often in this conversation about the US Southeast, Southern California is completely omitted.
Well, it looks like it's the go around of the next iteration of the Cure grant. We're going to be looking at the ACTG and other centers, so maybe it won't be as difficult.
Let's hope.
You know, another issue I think that has to be, that will help in the future, and we're going way off topic here, but I think I enjoy this discussion.
No, it's
so I personally have, you know, so a lot of the studies that have tried to look for a sex effect generally have been negative. But there are two big ones. One is this viral load effect in men versus women, and it has played out in Eileen's reservoir study. So this is a good example of why it's important to do it, because there are some fundamental differences, and they're probably explained by the immune system. But to me, the most compelling inspirational study showing, hey, we really got to study this because there could be profound differences, was the ADVANCE study. I don't know if you guys know this study. Do you know this recent publication in the New England Journal of Medicine?
I don't think so. I'm sure Richard does. Tell us about it. I don't think
it didn't have the impact that I thought it would have. It's a really important study. It's about 1,000 people in South Africa randomized. It's a treatment study. Mm-hmm. There are 1,000 people in South Africa, you know, primarily younger people, more women than men, but a lot of both. And they're randomized to 3 different treatment regimens with tenofovir or TAF or integrase inhibitors or favrins. And the weight gain, which was a major perceived toxicity, was substantially different in the women versus men.
Yes.
Yeah, the first, I know that study, right.
And the weight gain that was seen in women was pretty significant. It was like 10 kilograms in the dolutegravir TAF arm over 2 years, which
I mean,
What do you-
everybody's hearing weight gain, and the boys think it's going to happen to them too. But Jeff Murray told me it was mostly women, so that's how I know about it. So.
Yeah, no, that, Steve, that study I think is only just beginning to have its impact, and as the rollout of ART in sub-Saharan Africa with dolutegravir as the primary regimen continues, that is going to be a big story. But again, it's also a point where there's some science there. Something is happening, and it may be a change on a metabolic level or some other thing that we have not appreciated yet, but that's like a really interesting thing to study and for us to learn about how these things are happening with an automatic setup comparator group based on sex.
And I think there is, although obviously it doesn't have the same implications as that data, that there was a little bit of data from the TLR7 agonist hepatitis B, one of the hepatitis B trials found that there was a higher interferon-stimulated gene response in the women. But I don't think there was enough women in the HIV trial, or at least trials at least yet, to see that same difference.
Thanks for that, Richard.
It's timing.
Danielle, I'll let you move us forward. I don't, unless there's more, I mean, I think this great discussion. I don't think that there's anything else in particular here.
Move us along and talk about some of the facilitators and barriers of women's participation in HIV cure trials. Next slide, Elnas, please. Next slide. So we had an audience poll question to talk about what factors would influence a decision to join the clinical trial. Compensation was one of the top responses. Next slide. Okay. So Liz presented a bit of data from a recent paper out of the ACTG that unpacked some of the screen rates, the screen failure rates between men and women, and some of the preliminary findings or the findings of that effort showed or demonstrated that there was not an explanation for the lower numbers of women who screened out of clinical trials, but that in addition to considering that women are disproportionately burdened by some of the factors that Eileen mentioned earlier when you talk about gender violence, imbalanced relationship power dynamics, or quote unquote competing priorities. And then the question was asked, do women want to participate in HIV cure related trials? And the research showed that they do for a number of reasons, but there are perceived risks that are gendered. Next slide. And this is a slide that's credited to both Corinne Dubé and David Evans, that from their study where they describe what those perceived risks are by gender. And so some of the highlights of that was compared to men, cis or trans women are most likely to be concerned about the following risks. So increased likelihood of transmitting HIV to others during a medical study, which was where some of the discussion about secondary HIV transmission started to come to bear in our discussions in the session. Problems with bones or muscles, and obviously there was discussion around the need to delay pregnancy or having children. And then just again, in comparison to men, in comparison to cis and trans women, men are less likely to be concerned about these aforementioned risks. Next slide. And so here was a cool slide that Liz donated on behalf of Sarah Gianella. And they talked about, from a presentation that they have, what do scientists perceive some of the barriers to women's participation in cure research. And so you see them listed there. Again, you have the top 3 competing priorities: lack of appropriate incentives, cultural stigma, mistrust of the research, rigorous eligibility requirements, like pregnancy is most certainly a disclusionary principle that will keep women away from being enrolled in trials, lack of information, and it really begs the question as to what do we gauge to be the meaningful inclusion of women, pregnant women specifically, in clinical research trials. So it upends lots and lots of social and ethical discussions. Next slide. And so Eileen, if you wanted to grace us with discussion on the sex differences. If there are no questions, I'm so sorry.
No, we're good. I'm good. I don't know about anybody else.
Sorry, this is Eileen. So yeah, we can move forward. So this is just, we just did a little overview about the fact that diseases are different and there is a lot of sex specificity, whether it's an autoimmunity, cancer, vaccine responses, or an infection. And then the next slide, specifically, there are some examples of differences in HIV, specifically between men and women. This includes a lower viral load and untreated infection that attenuates with progression of disease, lower per cell HIV RNA production from lymph nodes, HIV RNA inducing more interferon alpha from immune cells, and enrichment of women among elite controllers, which that study has also been followed up by a second study that well. And so what about an HIV cure? So in the next slide, we just sort of summarized the things that we found with the original AMFAR cohort, which was that we had equivalent levels of HIV DNA, more HIV RNA expression in men, and more HIV plasma virus in men. And Steve, I don't think I've mentioned this to you, but I've been working a little bit with Tom Quinn's group here on their Ugandan cohort, where they had previously suggested that there was a difference in reservoir size in resource-limited settings versus resource-rich settings in a CID paper a couple of years ago. So they went back and recruited a bunch of men in Uganda, because they had mostly had women in Uganda, and it is actually a sex difference, and it's a difference in QVOA. So confirming sort of what we saw in a totally separate population, but direct comparison of Ugandan men to women, they have similar levels of HIV DNA and lower QVOAs in the women. So on the next slide, mechanism. So this is one potential mechanism which we discussed, which was estrogen blockade of HIV induction. And moving through these slides, it just shows how much HIV there is with no stimulation. Sorry, and then can just move forward. Then with T-cell activation, you get induction of some HIV RNA expression. Next slide. Then with T-cell activation in the presence of estrogen, you no longer see this robust induction of HIV. And the next slide. And then we tried to actually reverse this. So sorry that these slides got a little bit transposed, but what we saw in these original studies was measured differences in markers of viral persistence in the relationship to T-cell parameters and in transcriptional controls. And since the therapeutic targets in cure research are so host-directed, it just begs the question of whether or not we can really consider men and women to be the same. And so, translating back to the cancer field again, there is this suggestion among the cancer field, although it is hotly debated, that there's a sex difference in the efficacy of anti-PD-1 therapies, with women having less response to PD-1 modulation. There also is, from this Ugandan cohort, we also see that PD-1 is not associated with reservoir in women in the way that it is in men within that cohort, with the men's results recapitulating what's previously been shown and the women showing a lack of consistent relationship. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, and then these are just some potential mechanisms which we discussed, which include the basic differences of fat depots, also tissues of risk, but also the chromosomal complement, immune cell phenotypes, which are known to be different between men and women, and then the regulation of gene expression through epigenetics, as well as the microbiome. Again, just meant to illustrate that there's a lot of really sort of basic scientific reasons for why there are likely significant differences in the immune system. Next slide. Great. So I will take questions, and then I really apologize, but I'm going to have to drop off in the next 2 or 3 minutes. But is there anyone who had any questions or comments?
Pretty clear. I mean, I just think that we, as Danielle offered, we just need to work with you, because this is so important to you, and it's so important to us to see what we can do to move the needle a little bit. So whatever we can do, please feel free to call on us.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much. And it's the only way I'm going to be successful is with some help.
We appreciate you joining us.
Same way.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Danielle, you want to finish up?
Absolutely. I think I can hit the next 2 or 3 slides, really driving home some of the implications for policy-related lack of inclusion of women. Some of these policies that govern funding, as Eileen mentioned, research agendas and prevention strategies will continue to be implemented with a one-size-fits-all framework. Steve talked about this group of white gay men that served the Holocaust, the HIV-related Holocaust, but I remind folks that included in those survivors are also women and other people of color that may not be represented in the dominant narrative when we tell the story of those who survived. So remember, lessons that were taught to us, reminded of us by Gilead's most recent fiasco, the extrapolation of data or best guesstimates do not truly reflect the implications for women. They often exclude biomedical processes for women. There's a lack of objective and tangible information related to physical interactions, some of which Eileen overviewed in her slides, and that these continued practices will reinforce the exclusion of women in research and the otherizing of our bodies as these scientific revolutionaries come to play. Next slide. And next slide. So just a few recommendations for future studies. There are many complexities of women, right? We acknowledge, we accept, but they are not impossibilities. So as we offered to Eileen, really it's important to center women to center women in these conversations and to lean in to us and ask for our assistance and our best practices on how to recruit and retain other women. And we hope that you'll learn from other more recent experiences in the zeitgeist about what happens when you don't include and center women. So we want to center those frameworks around action and involvement, right? The involvement of women and the prioritization of women finally. And so we can stop there and take any remaining questions or points of discussion if you have them.
All right, good. Anybody else? Steve? Either Steve, Richard?
Nope. So tell me exactly how this presentation went. What was the feedback like?
The feedback was amazing. I think, as I mentioned, we had a wide range of folks in the room, from women living with HIV to consumers to other health professionals. We had some reporters in the space. Again, this was the only women-centered discussion around cure. I thought it went really well. The session was well attended. Barring any minor technical setbacks, we had a really well attended session and a robust discussion around the science and then future directions, really some of the prevailing themes that people wanted to hear more from us about.
I thought they were engaged, and then I thought they weren't engaged. I mean, I thought it was a good idea to do a session in the beginning, just explaining the basics of cure research and explaining, as Danielle summarized. But just like it reminded me when I did my first cure session in Baltimore, people are mesmerized, but they don't know what to ask, which means not that they don't understand, but they're just new. You know what I mean?
Sure,
So
of course.
I think that's the way I felt. And, we had those little things like we used at the ATI workshop where people could vote and stuff, and they were into it. And at the end, it was pretty, not only were they engaged, but they were pretty wound up, but mostly about women in trials per se. It wasn't as much about cure-specific trials. Don't you think, Danielle? It was just the general issues at the end.
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
I still think that the conversation about cure is something that's missing from the space.
Right? Oh, absolutely. I definitely agree with that. I mean, just like, mostly I have African-American MSM. And, you know, I mean, you can't just throw this at somebody for the first time. You know, you've got to keep it up and just keep trying to, you know, it's complicated and difficult. So it's a process. But, I mean, I don't know, they were very lively. I was a little bit nervous at first because there were like 5 people, but by the time it started, it was packed. Everybody comes to Cure Stuff. They love it. They're interested.
Absolutely.
Every session I've ever given, that anybody's ever given, the community shows up for it.
Yeah, and there's not enough of the biomedical science discussions happening at USCA. So this was great, and it was, you know, it was a challenging effort to get the session represented at USCA, but we were able to pull it off in the end. And, you know, all in all, the audience feedback was extremely positive. So I do hope that we can continue the conversation in future USCAs.
Did they share with you they obviously they did, you know, they asked people their opinions afterwards, but did they share the results with you?
I've asked for our session evaluation, some of the summary data.
So you haven't seen it yet?
I haven't seen it yet. I have not. But it will help legitimize our presence at future sessions where we talk about cure-specific efforts, even if it's not something focused on women.
Right.
So Danielle, do you have any fun photographs of you giving your presentation or of the panel or the audience? Because I want to.
I do.
I want to show this around. I want to make sure that our funders are aware of, because this is exactly what they want us to be doing.
Okay.
No, I was going to say I think it's a great thing for the CAP to be doing.
Yeah.
This is just as exact. Yeah. So send me a picture.
I'll send you several.
We'll make you famous.
Infamous.
And I'll take credit for all your work because I'm good at doing that.
No, you're not like that.
But again, we really were appreciative of the opportunity to present this information at the USCA conference. So many thanks again.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Other folks who helped, you know, get us there and on the agenda.
Right. All right. Well, what time is it? It is
55.
about 5 minutes. Anybody else? You know, Richard, maybe at Croy we could save you know, there's been a lot of, you know, of information lately. Maybe we could have a little session in Cure, you know, spend some of the time at the pre-Croy meeting, the Cure meeting on women this time.
Oh, please.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, Eileen very kindly came and presented a few years ago. I think it would be great to revisit. And it sounds like there's some new data that she was talking about from Uganda as well. And actually, I have to email everybody because we got an approval from Croy to hold the pre-Croy workshop next year. So I'll be reaching out in the next few days to start thinking about organizing.
And Steve Deeks, DARE is always represented on that. I mean, we're a, you know, what are we called? Sponsor.
Co-sponsor, yeah.
Sponsor or whatever. So.
It's great. Good news. Okay, guys.
All right. Thank you for coming. And
all right.
Thank you all.
Thanks for that update. Bye, guys.
Okay. Bye-bye.